Marcus Chen stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 6:30 a.m., adjusting his cycling gear with careful precision. At 34 years old, he had followed this same morning routine for the past 3 years, ever since he decided to make the switch from driving to cycling to work. His small but tidy apartment in downtown Seattle offered a perfect starting point for his daily commute to the law firm where he worked as an environmental lawyer. Outside his window, the early autumn rain created a gentle pattern against the glass. Marcus checked his weather app one more time. 57 degrees Fahrenheit with a 70% chance of continued drizzle throughout the morning. Perfect Seattle weather, he thought with a slight smile. While others might complain about the constant rain, Marcus had grown to appreciate it. The wet weather meant fewer cyclists on the road, giving him more space to maneuver through the busy streets. In his kitchen, Marcus prepared his usual pre-ride breakfast, a banana, 2 pieces of whole wheat toast with peanut butter, and a strong cup of black coffee. As he ate, he scrolled through his email, noting that he had an important client meeting at 9:30 a.m. Plenty of time, he thought, calculating his usual 40-minute ride to the office. His bike stood in the corner of his living room, treated more like a prized possession than a mere mode of transportation. It was a sleek Trek road bike, metallic blue in color, that had cost him 3 months' worth of savings. Marcus ran his hand along the frame, checking for any signs of wear as he did every morning. The routine was almost meditative. Check the tire pressure, test the brakes, ensure the chain was properly lubricated. Before heading out, Marcus put on his high-visibility yellow jacket over his cycling clothes. Safety had always been his top priority, and he took pride in never having had a serious accident in all his years of urban cycling. He clipped on his new helmet camera, a recent purchase after hearing stories of increasing road rage incidents in the city. The small device gave him an added sense of security, though he hoped he'd never need the footage. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Marcus wheeled his bike down the hallway of his apartment building, nodding good morning to Mrs. Rodriguez from apartment 3B, who was returning from her night shift as a nurse. The elderly woman always had a kind word for him, often telling him to be careful on those crazy streets. The building's elevator was out of order again, forcing Marcus to carry his bike down 4 flights of stairs. He didn't mind, he saw it as an extra part of his morning workout. The stairwell smelled of fresh paint. The building management had finally started on their long-promised renovations. Stepping out into the morning air, Marcus felt the light rain on his face. The streets were beginning to fill with early morning traffic, but not yet at their peak. The wet pavement reflected the city lights, creating a beautiful urban landscape that most car commuters probably never noticed. This was one of the things Marcus loved about cycling. It connected him to the city in a way that driving never had. He checked his bike lights one final time, front and rear both blinking brightly. His panniers were securely fastened, containing his work clothes, neatly folded to avoid wrinkles, laptop, and lunch. Marcus had his route memorized: down 4th Avenue, cut through Pioneer Square, then along the waterfront before turning into the business district. On a good day, with favorable traffic lights, he could make it in 35 minutes. As he clipped into his pedals and pushed off from the curb, Marcus felt the familiar surge of energy that came with starting his ride. The cool morning air filled his lungs, and his muscles quickly found their rhythm. He could see his breath in the chilly air, creating small clouds that quickly disappeared into the drizzle. Little did Marcus know that this ordinary morning, with its familiar routines and comfortable predictability, was about to turn into something entirely different. As he pedaled through the quiet streets of early morning Seattle, he was completely unaware that in less than an hour, his carefully structured world would be shaken by an encounter that would test his patience, judgment, and self-control in ways he never expected. The first 20 minutes of Marcus's ride went smoothly. The rain had eased to a light mist, and the morning traffic flowed steadily through Seattle's downtown streets. He had already covered half of his usual route, feeling good about making it to work with plenty of time before his 9:30 meeting. As Marcus approached the narrow section of 2nd Avenue, where construction had reduced the road to 2 lanes, he noticed traffic beginning to bunch up. The clock on his bike computer showed 7:45 a.m., the start of peak morning rush hour. He carefully positioned himself in the rightmost lane, staying visible just as his cycling safety courses had taught him. Behind him, a chorus of car horns suddenly broke the morning rhythm. Marcus glanced over his shoulder to see a black Range Rover weaving between lanes, its driver clearly impatient with the slow-moving traffic. The SUV was cutting off other vehicles, leaving a trail of angry honks in its wake. Marcus kept his focus forward, but he could hear the Range Rover getting closer. The sound of its powerful engine grew louder, and in his peripheral vision, he saw the massive vehicle beginning to pass him. That's when everything changed. Instead of moving to the left lane to pass safely, the Range Rover's driver chose to squeeze through the narrow gap between Marcus and a delivery truck. The side mirror of the SUV came so close to Marcus's handlebars that he could have reached out and touched it. The rush of air from the passing vehicle made his bike wobble dangerously. Marcus's heart jumped into his throat. He instinctively swerved toward the curb, his front tire hitting a wet patch of road paint. For a terrifying moment, he thought he would lose control completely. His cycling shoes scraped against the pavement as he fought to stay upright, managing to regain his balance just inches from the curb. The Range Rover didn't slow down. Instead, its driver laid on the horn, a long, aggressive blast that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Through the SUV's tinted rear window, Marcus could make out the driver's face in the rearview mirror. A man probably in his 50s, wearing what looked like an expensive suit, his face twisted in obvious annoyance. As Marcus steadied himself, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: pure, unfiltered anger. His hands were shaking on the handlebars, not from fear anymore, but from rage. The morning's peaceful ride had transformed into a pulse-pounding confrontation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. 3 years of careful cycling, following every safety rule, being courteous to drivers, and this was what he got in return. Marcus reached up and double-tapped his helmet camera, making sure it was recording. The red light blinked reassuringly. At least he had evidence of what had just happened. Traffic ahead had slowed to a crawl, and Marcus could still see the Range Rover about 50 yards ahead, its brake lights glowing as it approached the next intersection. Without fully thinking through his actions, Marcus began to pedal harder, his legs pumping with newfound energy fueled by adrenaline and anger. Other cyclists might have let it go. On any other day, Marcus himself would probably have taken a few deep breaths and continued his ride, telling himself it wasn't worth the confrontation. But something about this morning was different. Maybe it was the near miss that had scared him more than he wanted to admit. Maybe it was the driver's complete disregard for his safety, or that arrogant blast of the horn, as if Marcus had no right to be on the road at all. The light ahead turned red, and the Range Rover came to a stop behind 3 other cars. Marcus saw his chance. The bike lane was clear, and he could easily pull up right next to the driver's window. His heart was pounding now, but not from exertion. The usual Marcus, calm, professional, measured in his responses, seemed to have been left behind somewhere in the morning mist. As he pedaled forward, weaving carefully between the stopped cars, Marcus rehearsed what he would say to the driver. He wanted to be assertive, but not aggressive, firm, but not confrontational. Yet with each push of the pedals, his planned measured response was being overtaken by a growing desire to make sure this driver understood exactly what he had done wrong. The gap between Marcus and the Range Rover narrowed. 20 yards, 10 yards, 5. He had no way of knowing that his next decision would set in motion a chain of events that would make him question everything about this morning, and himself. Marcus pulled up alongside the Range Rover, his chest heaving not just from the effort of cycling, but from the surge of adrenaline coursing through his body. Through the tinted window, he could now clearly see the driver, a large man with graying hair at his temples, drumming his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. The traffic light remained red, giving Marcus a moment to catch his breath. He looked down at his hands and noticed they were trembling slightly on the handlebars. A small voice in the back of his head whispered that he should just ride away, that nothing good could come from what he was about to do. But the memory of that side mirror nearly clipping him was still too fresh, too raw. Just as Marcus was about to knock on the driver's window, the light turned green. The Range Rover's engine roared to life, and the vehicle surged forward, cutting off Marcus once again. This time, Marcus was ready. Instead of backing down, he pedaled harder, pushing his bike to keep pace with the SUV. Other commuters watched the strange chase unfold. A woman in a blue Honda shook her head disapprovingly. A bus driver leaned forward in his seat, clearly concerned about the developing situation. But Marcus noticed none of this. His world had narrowed to the black vehicle in front of him and the growing need to confront its driver. The morning drizzle had picked up again, making the roads slicker. Water sprayed up from Marcus's tires as he weaved through traffic, keeping the Range Rover in sight. His expensive cycling shoes, usually so secure in their pedal clips, were becoming slippery. Every corner felt dangerous, every sudden stop a risk, but Marcus couldn't let himself think about that now. Traffic forced the Range Rover to slow down again at the next intersection. Marcus saw his opportunity. Using his knowledge of downtown Seattle's streets, he cut through a narrow gap between cars and positioned himself directly in front of the SUV. It was a dangerous move, one that went against everything he believed about cycling safety, but in that moment, he didn't care. The driver laid on his horn again, the sound even more aggressive than before. In his rearview mirror, Marcus could see the man's face turning red with anger. Several pedestrians on the sidewalk stopped to watch the confrontation, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Marcus maintained his position, forcing the Range Rover to trail behind him at bicycle speed. He could hear the engine revving impatiently, feel the pressure of the large vehicle looming behind him. His helmet camera was still recording, capturing every moment of this increasingly tense situation. A delivery truck driver called out from his cab, "Hey man, it's not worth it." But Marcus pretended not to hear. The rational part of his brain, the part that had helped him win cases in court and negotiate difficult situations, seemed to have switched off completely. They continued this way for another block, Marcus deliberately pedaling slowly, the Range Rover forced to crawl along behind him. Other cyclists passing by gave him concerned looks. One even slowed down to ask if he needed help, but Marcus waved him off. This was his fight. Through the reflection in a store window, Marcus caught glimpses of the driver making angry gestures behind his steering wheel. The man was now talking on his phone, his free hand gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The rain continued to fall, soaking through Marcus's cycling jacket. His clothes were becoming uncomfortable, his visibility through his glasses starting to blur. These were dangerous conditions for what he was doing, but the discomfort only fueled his determination. As they approached the next major intersection near Pike Place Market, Marcus knew he had to make a decision. The morning traffic was getting heavier, and his client meeting was getting closer. But he couldn't let this go, not now, not after coming this far. The light ahead turned yellow, then red. This time, Marcus was ready. He unclipped his shoes from the pedals and planted his feet firmly on the wet pavement. Behind him, the Range Rover's brakes squealed slightly as it came to a stop. The moment for a direct confrontation had finally arrived. Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for what would come next. In his 3 years of urban cycling, he had never done anything like this. As he turned to face the Range Rover, he had no idea that he was about to learn a harsh lesson about the price of letting anger override common sense. Marcus dismounted his bike with shaking hands, his heart pounding so loud he could hear it in his ears. The morning crowd at Pike Place Market had started to gather, creating an unwitting audience for what was about to unfold. The smell of fresh coffee and bread from nearby kegs mixed with the damp morning air. Still recording with his helmet camera, Marcus walked toward the driver's side of the Range Rover. The window began to lower with a smooth electronic whir, revealing the driver's face clearly for the first time. Marcus's confidence wavered slightly as he realized just how large the man was. "The name's Keith Thompson," the driver said before Marcus could speak, his voice surprisingly calm but carrying an underlying edge. "And you're making a big mistake." Keith was easily 6'4", with broad shoulders that stretched his expensive gray suit. His clean-shaven face and neatly trimmed hair suggested corporate success, but his clenched jaw and reddened face revealed barely controlled anger. A small crowd had started to form around them. A barista from the corner coffee shop stood in the doorway, holding her phone up. 2 construction workers paused their work across the street, watching intently. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, drivers honking their displeasure at the growing scene. "You nearly killed me back there," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. He could feel his lawyer training kicking in, wanting to present his case logically. "You have to give cyclists 3 feet of space. It's the law." Keith unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of his vehicle. The action was smooth but deliberate, almost predatory. Now standing, he towered over Marcus, who suddenly felt very aware of how vulnerable he was in his cycling clothes. The light rain continued to fall, making the pavement beneath them slick and treacherous. "Listen here, bike boy," Keith said, taking a step closer. I got a board meeting in 15 minutes that will decide if 200 people keep their jobs. I don't have time for your little cycling crusade." His breath smelled of expensive coffee and stress. Marcus stood his ground, though every instinct told him to back away. "That doesn't give you the right to endanger people's lives," he replied, gesturing to his helmet camera. "I got it all on video." This seemed to trigger something in Keith. His face flushed darker, and a vein became visible on his forehead. "You want to talk about endangering lives?" he growled. "You cyclists think you own the road. My daughter was late to her college interview last week because of people like you blocking traffic." The crowd had grown larger now. Someone in the back shouted, "Just let it go, both of you." But neither man seemed to hear. They were locked in their confrontation, each feeling righteous in their anger, each refusing to back down. Marcus noticed Keith's hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The man's wedding ring caught the weak morning light as he flexed his fingers. Despite his own anger, Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't a courtroom where he could rely on rules and procedures. This was raw emotion on a wet Seattle street, with no clear way to de-escalate. "I'm just asking you to follow the law," Marcus said, trying to sound reasonable while keeping his eye on Keith's increasingly agitated movements. "Next time, you could actually hit someone." Keith took another step forward, now well within Marcus's personal space. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "You think that little camera makes you untouchable. You think you can provoke people and hide behind your cyclist rights." The tension in the air was electric. Cars continued to move slowly around them, some drivers now pulling over to watch. A delivery truck driver had stopped completely, his hazard lights blinking in the rain. The morning drizzle had soaked through both men's clothes, but neither seemed to notice. Marcus could feel his professional demeanor slipping away with each passing second. He had faced tough opponents in court before, but this was different. This was primal, immediate, and he was starting to realize he had miscalculated badly. The look in Keith's eyes suggested this confrontation was about much more than just a near miss on the road. The morning rain continued to fall as Marcus and Keith stood facing each other near Pike Place Market. The crowd around them had grown to about 30 people, their phones recording every moment of the confrontation. Steam rose from a nearby storm drain, adding to the tense atmosphere. "You cyclists are all the same," Keith said, his voice getting louder with each word. "Acting like you're saving the planet while making everyone else late for work." He pulled out his phone, showing Marcus his screen. "See this? My company's stock price drops every minute I'm not in that meeting." Marcus felt his own temper rising to match Keith's. 3 years of pent-up frustration with aggressive drivers came pouring out. "Oh, so your meeting is more important than my life?" he shot back, pointing at his bike. "You came within inches of hitting me. Do you know how many cyclists die every year because of drivers like you?" A young woman in the crowd tried to intervene. "Guys, please, it's not worth it," she said, stepping forward. Both men ignored her. The confrontation had moved beyond the point where reasonable voices could reach them. Keith's phone buzzed again in his hand. He glanced at it, his face growing even redder. "That's the 5th message from my CEO," he growled. "You know what? You want to talk about rights? I pay more in road tax every month than your bike cost." Marcus laughed bitterly, his lawyer instincts taking over. "That's not how road tax works, and you know it. Maybe if you left earlier for your precious meeting, you wouldn't need to endanger people's lives." This comment seemed to hit a nerve. Keith took another step forward, now standing so close that Marcus could see the expensive silk tie clip on his chest. "You don't know anything about my life," Keith said, his voice shaking. "My wife's in the hospital, my daughter's college tuition is due, and this meeting could save my entire department. But sure, lecture me about leaving earlier." The revelation about Keith's personal problems briefly made Marcus pause. For a moment, he saw the man differently, not just an angry driver, but someone drowning in stress and responsibility. But before Marcus could process this, Keith continued his tirade. "You think you're so righteous with your bike and your camera," Keith spat out, "but you're just a troublemaker looking for attention. How many other drivers have you harassed this week?" The comment stung Marcus's pride. "I'm not the one harassing people," he retorted. "Everything you've done is recorded right here." He tapped his helmet camera for emphasis. It was the wrong move. Keith's eyes fixed on the camera, his expression changing from anger to something more dangerous. That little camera makes you feel pretty brave, doesn't it? He said, taking another step forward. The crowd tensed, sensing the shift in energy. Marcus could smell the coffee on Keith's breath as the larger man loomed over him. Despite his rising fear, Marcus stood his ground. Back off, he warned, though his voice wasn't as steady as he would have liked. Everything's being recorded. A construction worker from across the street started walking over, clearly concerned about where this was heading. The morning traffic had almost completely stopped now, drivers watching the scene unfold through their windshields. You know what your problem is? Keith's voice had dropped to a menacing whisper. You hide behind that camera instead of dealing with things like a man. In my day, we settled things face to face. Marcus felt trapped between his fear and his pride. Part of him wanted to back down, to walk away from this increasingly dangerous situation. But another part, the part that had chased down the Range Rover in the first place, refused to show weakness. Is that a threat? Marcus asked, trying to sound confident despite his racing heart. Want to add assault to your traffic violations? The crowd murmured nervously. Someone mentioned calling the police. The construction worker was now just a few feet away. But both men remained locked in their confrontation, like two storms about to collide. Neither Marcus nor Keith realized that in the next few seconds, their confrontation would cross a line that neither of them could take back. The tension between Marcus and Keith had reached its peak. The morning rain had turned into a light drizzle, and the crowd around them held their breath, sensing that something was about to snap. Steam rose from the nearby coffee shop's vents, creating an almost cinematic backdrop to the confrontation. Keith's eyes remained fixed on Marcus's helmet camera. His next movement happened so fast that the crowd barely had time to react. In one swift motion, his hand shot out toward Marcus's helmet. Let's see how brave you are without this, he growled, grabbing the camera and yanking it hard. The sound of breaking plastic filled the air as Keith ripped the camera from its mount. The force of his action caused Marcus to stumble backward, his cycling shoes slipping on the wet pavement. The expensive camera crashed to the ground, skidding across the wet surface and leaving pieces of broken plastic in its wake. My camera, Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. The device had cost him nearly $400, but it wasn't just about the money. It represented his safety, his security on the roads. Without thinking, he lunged forward to retrieve it. This was exactly what Keith had been waiting for. As Marcus bent down to reach for the broken camera, Keith used his larger frame to shove him forcefully. Marcus lost his balance completely this time, falling backward into his bicycle. Both he and the bike crashed to the ground with a loud clatter. The crowd erupted into chaos. Hey, stop that, someone shouted. Someone call the police, yelled another voice. Phones were raised higher, recording every moment of the violence that was unfolding before them. Marcus lay on the wet ground, his cycling jersey soaked and dirty. His expensive bike lay beside him, the front wheels still spinning slowly. He could feel a sharp pain in his elbow where he had hit the pavement. His glasses had been knocked askew, and he quickly straightened them, trying to regain his composure. Keith stood over him, his business suit now wrinkled and damp, his tie hanging loosely. The man's face showed a mix of emotions. Anger still dominated, but there was also a flicker of shock, as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. The construction worker who had been approaching finally reached them. That's enough, he shouted, positioning himself between Keith and Marcus. His orange safety vest was bright against the gray morning as he extended his arms to keep the two men apart. Marcus slowly got to his feet, his legs shaking. His cycling shorts were torn at the knee, and he could feel blood beginning to trickle down his leg. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. This wasn't just an argument anymore, it had turned into assault. You're going to pay for this, Marcus said, his lawyer's mind already calculating the damages. Destruction of property, assault, battery. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands, trying to take pictures of his injuries and the broken camera. Keith's face suddenly changed as the consequences of his actions seemed to dawn on him. The rage that had possessed him moments ago drained away, replaced by something that looked like fear. I didn't mean to, he stammered, looking around at the crowd of witnesses. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Some in the crowd had indeed called the police. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held everyone in place. Some spectators began to drift away, while others stayed, still recording, not wanting to miss the conclusion of the drama. Marcus's bike lay on its side, the front wheel slightly bent from the fall. It was a perfect metaphor for how quickly things had spiraled out of control. What had started as a traffic dispute had transformed into something that would have lasting consequences for both men. The pain in Marcus's elbow was getting worse, and he could feel his adrenaline starting to wear off. Reality was crashing in hard. His client meeting, his carefully planned day, his professional image. Everything was in shambles, just like his bicycle and camera on the wet Seattle street. The police siren was very close now. Both men stood in silence, waiting for what would come next, each realizing that their morning had taken a turn that neither could have predicted or wanted. The police cruiser pulled up to the scene with its lights flashing, casting blue and red reflections on the wet pavement. Two officers stepped out, Officer Sarah Martinez and Officer James Wilson. They quickly took in the scene, a man in a torn cycling outfit, another in a rumpled business suit, a damaged bicycle, and a crowd of onlookers with their phones raised. "Break it up, everyone," Officer Martinez commanded, her voice firm but calm. She approached Marcus first, noticing his bleeding knee and the way he cradled his elbow. "Sir, are you in need of medical attention?" Before Marcus could answer, a young woman from the crowd stepped forward. "I recorded everything," she said, holding up her phone. The guy in the suit attacked him. He broke his camera and pushed him down. Several other witnesses nodded in agreement, some offering to share their videos as evidence. Officer Wilson turned his attention to Keith, who had backed up against his Range Rover. The businessman's aggressive demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a look of worried resignation. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your identification," the officer said. As Keith reached for his wallet with shaking hands, his phone buzzed again. The screen showed 15 missed calls from his office. The board meeting he was supposed to attend had started 5 minutes ago. He looked at his phone, then at the officers, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. The construction worker who had intervened earlier gave his account to Officer Martinez. "I saw the whole thing," he explained. "Started as a traffic dispute, but this fellow here," he pointed at Keith, lost his cool and turned it physical. Marcus sat on the curb while a newly arrived paramedic examined his elbow. The pain had gotten worse, and the paramedic suspected it might be sprained. His torn cycling clothes and dirty appearance made him look nothing like the professional lawyer he was supposed to be. "Do you want to press charges?" Officer Martinez asked Marcus, her notebook ready. The question hung in the air for a moment. Marcus looked at Keith, who was now speaking quietly with Officer Wilson, his shoulders slumped in defeat. More people from the crowd came forward to give statements. The barista from the coffee shop described how the confrontation had escalated. A delivery driver explained the dangerous driving he had witnessed. Each new testimony made Keith's situation worse. The paramedic finished wrapping Marcus's elbow and cleaned his knee wound. "You should get an X-ray to be sure nothing's broken," she advised. "And watch for signs of concussion, even though you didn't hit your head." Marcus nodded, still trying to process how his morning commute had turned into this mess. Keith's phone kept buzzing. This time, it was a text from his wife. "How's the meeting going? Doctor says I might be released tomorrow." He stared at the message, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of his actions was crushing down on him. Officer Martinez collected the broken pieces of Marcus's helmet camera, placing them in an evidence bag. "We'll need this," she said. "And we'll also need both of you to come down to the station to give formal statements." The morning traffic had started to move again, drivers slowing down to look at the scene as they passed. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but those who remained were still recording, probably planning to post the videos on social media later. Marcus's law firm called his phone. He let it go to voicemail, knowing he couldn't explain this situation in a quick phone call. His client meeting was definitely not happening now. 3 years of building a professional reputation in Seattle, and now this would be what people remembered him for. The rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. Marcus's expensive bike leaned against a pole, its front wheel noticeably bent. Keith's Range Rover was parked awkwardly, its hazard lights still blinking. Both men's morning plans lay in ruins around them, like the scattered pieces of the broken camera on the wet pavement. Officer Wilson finished taking Keith's statement and turned to address both men. "We're going to need you both to come with us to the station," he said. "We'll sort this out there." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. As they prepared to leave the scene, neither Marcus nor Keith could look at each other. Both men were lost in their own thoughts, wondering how a few moments of anger had managed to derail their entire lives. In the fluorescent-lit police station, Marcus sat on an uncomfortable plastic chair, holding an ice pack to his elbow. 3 hours had passed since the incident. His cycling clothes had dried awkwardly, making him feel even more out of place in the professional setting of the police station. Down the hall, in a separate room, Keith was finishing his statement to Officer Martinez. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie long since removed and stuffed into his pocket. His phone had finally stopped buzzing. The board meeting was long over, and his fate at the company hung in uncertain balance. Marcus checked his own phone. 27 missed calls, 15 from his law firm, 5 from his biggest client, and 7 from his worried mother who had somehow already seen the viral videos on social media. One of the recordings had reached over 50,000 views in just a few hours, with comments flooding in from both cycling advocates and angry drivers. Officer Wilson approached Marcus with a cup of coffee. "Your bike's been logged into evidence," he explained. "You can claim it once the report is filed, but you might want to have it checked at a repair shop first." Marcus nodded, thinking about the expensive repairs his Trek bicycle would need. In the other room, Keith had just finished calling his wife. Explaining to her why he wasn't at the board meeting had been hard enough. Telling her about the assault charges was even harder. Her response, silence followed by a deep sigh, hurt more than any angry words could have. The station buzzed with activity as more witnesses came in to give statements. The barista, still in her coffee-stained apron, described how the situation had escalated. The construction worker's account matched the video evidence perfectly. Each new testimony made both men sink deeper into regret. Marcus's law firm sent him an email requesting an urgent meeting about the incident. The subject line mentioned professional conduct expectations. His stomach churned as he read it. Environmental lawyers who got into street fights didn't tend to keep their clients for long. Keith's secretary called with the news he had been dreading. The board meeting had gone badly, his absence had been noted, and when videos of the incident started circulating online, the company's PR team went into crisis mode. His future at the firm was now uncertain at best. A young police officer brought in Marcus's damaged helmet camera in an evidence bag. "Tech team says they can recover the footage," she said. Marcus looked at the broken device, remembering how proud he'd been when he first bought it. It was supposed to make him safer on the roads, not lead to this. Around noon, both men were called into separate rooms with a mediator. The police had suggested this might be a way to resolve the situation without pressing formal charges. Neither man felt particularly cooperative, but both recognized that more conflict would only make things worse. The mediator, a patient woman named Ms. Thompson, shuttled between rooms, carrying messages and proposals. Keith offered to pay for the damaged bike and camera. Marcus's lawyer instincts wanted to push for more, but a deeper part of him just wanted this day to end. Outside the station, life went on. Cyclists pedaled past, cars humped in traffic, and pedestrians hurried along the wet Seattle sidewalks. None of them knew that inside, two men were learning hard lessons about anger, pride, and the true cost of losing control. By late afternoon, an agreement was reached. Keith would pay for all damages and attend an anger management course. Marcus agreed not to press charges, recognizing that ruining Keith's life wouldn't make the roads any safer for cyclists. As they left the station separately, both men caught glimpses of their reflections in the glass doors. Marcus saw not the confident environmental lawyer he'd been that morning, but someone who had let anger override his better judgment. Keith saw not the successful businessman, but someone whose stress and frustration had nearly cost him everything. The rain had started again as Marcus called a rideshare to take him home. His bike wouldn't be released for another day, and his elbow throbbed with every movement. Keith walked to his Range Rover alone, his phone finally silent after the chaos of the day. Neither man would ever forget this rainy Seattle morning, a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest battles we face aren't with others, but with our own anger and pride. As they headed their separate ways, both Marcus and Keith knew that tomorrow they would need to start rebuilding what their moment of rage had broken.